invite back to the stage Deborah Taylor again. No, we're all very grateful for every participant. And again, you're now going to be talking about demands for due diligence and proposed EU legislation covering sustainability and due diligence, because this is an important part of the governance of ethical and sustainable companies. So I'm now going to hand over to Deborah. Thanks again. And lead us through to the...
Thank you. Brilliant. Thank you. Okay, welcome back, everyone. This is not going to take too long, but I think it is quite important that you have an overview at a high level on what some of this proposed incoming legislation could mean for us in the leather industry. And there could be some really significant impacts if we don't prepare well right now. And I think something that we haven't talked about yet is, why do we have this increased need for robust due diligence? And primarily, it's because we talked about it, greenwashing. We've talked about these sustainability claims that can't be substantiated, and a number of other reasons. You know, negative publicity. We all have heard of brands that have become the focus of some breach, either of an environmental parameter or human rights and that sort of thing. So there is an increased demand and pressure from civil society and consumers in general to understand what's going into the products they're buying and what they can trust about those products that they're buying. I'm going to counsel that very slightly, because there is a bit of a disconnect between what the consumers tell us that they want and what they actually purchase when they're in store. And a really good example of this was a UN event in Milan last September. And I've been working on this project with the UNEC for enhancing traceability and transparency for more sustainable value chains in the garment and footwear sector. And it's a project that we've been working on for the last couple of years. We did a big workshop in Milan. It's not just leather, it's all textiles. And there was a guy there from a denim manufacturer, and he held up 2 pairs of jeans, and he went, one of these pairs of jeans is sustainable rubber being used to give it its stretch and its durability. The other is standard lycra. One's been produced sustainable practices, the other is just standard production practices. This pair costs £89, this pair costs £49. You're in the store as a consumer. Why are you going to pay £89 for a pair of jeans that looks identical, is going to fit you the same way, maybe will last you just as long? Why are you going to pay the extra? We have to get better at talking about those reasons and people understanding that sustainability does cost. We can't do it for free. So, civil society want to know more. They're not always willing to pay more, and we do have to turn that narrative around. But back to the topic at hand. There are 3 key pieces of legislative or regulatory work that are coming into force. The first one we'll talk about is the European Union due diligence legislation, which has an annex that specifically calls out importation of any commodity from a high-risk deforestation area, and it calls out not just the meat and all forms of meat, but it also calls out raw hides, pickle, crust, finished leather. It captures everything, wet blue. So anything that's coming in at whatever stage of process of the leather making will have to be able to provide due diligence that it isn't coming in from a high-risk commodity. We've got the UK Environment Act, and this has got a secondary measure that is under discussion right now. We'll talk about that. And that second measure is again around forest risk commodities. And then more recently this year, the New York State Senate have introduced a bill for fashion brands and retailers that operate in the state of New York. And again, that will have implications for due diligence and the ability to provide that chain of custody around sourcing. Let's look at the EU due diligence first. So it was published on 17th of November. I've mentioned already that there are 6 key commodities that are within this, of which cattle and cattle byproducts is one. You can see the other commodities there as well. This isn't just something that applies to the leather industry. It's quite important to point that out. And I'm hearing the same conversation from agriculture, from soy and palm industries that are saying, how are we going to address this and provide this due diligence? So this isn't something that we're working on in isolation. It's something that is going to affect other industries as well. And that leads you to ask the question, well, why aren't we working with those other industries? Why can we not find a solution or a system that could support all industry in these endeavours? You'll see that they haven't ruled out rubber at the moment, but it's not included as we speak. Now, this, we don't have the detail on. I'll talk about it a bit later on what we don't know yet, but it will be large organisations. So there will be some exemptions for small and medium-sized enterprises. And we don't know the full mechanics of everything yet, but it's coming. I think we'll probably have a window of 2 years, really, to get our house in order. Otherwise, we will feel the effects of what we can see here in the bold on this slide. We will find European countries unable to import material from places like Brazil. And we heard from Clevio at Vancouros. This is why it's so important for the guys in Brazil to start working. And they have to work cross-sector as well. They have to start working with the meat packers and the meat industry in Brazil to find solutions that will work. We know that in Brazil, they have some of the same animal health legislation that we have. And they have a system called the GTA, which is a tracking system over there that tracks animals for their animal health purposes. We can't hook onto that for our traceability because they fear that people might go a bit more underground with their ranching and they'll lose the animal health side of it that they really need. So they don't want to tack on this traceability for due diligence to something that already exists. But the fact that there is something that already exists means there is something that we can do. And if we can then connect the dots between the farming and move that on into the leather manufacture, then we extend out that due diligence ability for that importation still to take place. So the EU Commission has adopted the resolution of the draft and it was unchallenged, and we expect that it will become legislation very soon. There will be a lead-in period. We don't know what that will be. My guess is we'll have a 2-year window before it will bite. Moving on to the UK Environment Act, primarily around targets and objectives that refer to us here in the UK. However, this secondary provision that is now under discussion is about the use of forest risk commodities, about how they could enforce any breach of that, and about general provisions around what is expected around that due diligence. Again, larger organisations, we just completed a 14-week period of review and feedback that was open to anybody to consult. That's now closed, and they're now looking at how they will implement those measures. So we were in a conference just a couple of weeks ago, which was an EU-Brazil conference, and a lot of the conversation was about what still isn't known rather than what we do know. We just know that these measures are going to come in. And so for us as an industry, we need to start putting our house in order now so that we can, when we get hit with them, say, okay, we know what we're doing. And then the New York State Senate introduction of the Factory Sustainability and Social Accountability Act. Not quite as far-reaching, but any large retailer that operates in New York, they don't have to have their base there, but if they're operating, if they're selling something there, then they will be bound by this potential legislation. Now, there is a few more knowns here. You know, they're talking about organisations that have a turnover in excess of $100 million, and they have to just make disclosures. So again, what kind of a disclosure? How far-reaching will that be? Some of these details are still not known. But they have to do supply chain mapping. They have to know where their risks are along that supply chain. and they have to publicly publish information about this work. So it will be open to scrutiny, which will make them a lot more accountable to what they're doing. I'm not going to read it all, but you can see it there. So how could this impact us? Well, restriction of imported raw materials is the key factor. If we have restrictions as a result of what we can import, that could have real disruption to supply and demand. So let's say all our major brands just say, okay, not going to source from Brazil, far too challenging, I don't know what to do there, so I'll just source from somewhere else. And everybody else has that same idea. Then the demand from supplies from certain regions is going to go through the roof, and we're going to lose demand over in Brazil. The knock-on effect of that can be really detrimental across many areas, because you're going to decimate the industry in Brazil, or you're going to force it even more underground at rock bottom prices, which affects social aspects of life in Brazil, where they're still an emerging economy, they're still growing and developing. At the same time, if prices raise over here, then suddenly we have a whole heap of tanners that maybe now have to pay more for their raw material. And for some, that could put them out of business. You know, it could be as serious as that, especially if they're a smaller concern. And you may end up with only the largest that can survive. Now, these are, you know, if we get our house in order, this might not happen. But this is what could happen if we don't get a handle on this. It's really important, I think, for us to understand that it is possible. You know, I mean, we listened to Clebio earlier say that there are a lot of branches that are operating legally in legal areas. How can we record that? How can we demonstrate that? And one of the things that I think is going to happen is we are going to have to be able to track material per head of cattle. You know, you can't keep operating on this herd mentality. I don't know whether any of you have heard of this. They call it cattle laundering, a bit like money laundering. You know, the cattle moves from birth farm to an intermediary farm, and then it goes to the direct farm that supplies the slaughterhouse or the meat packer. But it's what's happening in that transfer where we've got the concern and the risk that some of it is coming in from these deforestation areas. So we need to start thinking about how we can utilize existing technologies. We know there are some out there. If we can't hook onto something that exists, can we replicate that for our purposes? And I think crucially what we have to do is start working together as an industry about this for now. You know, if you have a very sewn up supply chain, this may not be as important to you on the surface, but it could still become important to you if suddenly there are a heap of other people that all want to use where you're sourcing your material from. You know, so even if you are primarily based in the UK right now, if you've suddenly got Italian tanneries that are coming after those UK sources as well, then it could disrupt things. So this isn't something that we can just say isn't ours to worry about. It's Europe, it's Brazil, it will become a global issue. So we have to take care. What don't we know yet? Well, we don't know when these things will become mandatory. We know they will, we just don't know when. We also don't know exactly what due diligence entails. So is it going to be enough that you could maybe use an association like LWG or SLF? I wasn't going to mention SLF in this presentation because I think it's come up enough today, but if you were going to use one of those organisations to provide that due diligence, is that enough? Or does that individual brand need to know the names and addresses of every actor along that value chain right back to the farm? If it's the former, then I think we're in good shape, because organisations like LWG, like SLF, like maybe architects even, can become the custodians of that chain of custody for you and protect your commercial integrity still within that chain of custody. But if the brand needs to know about it, then we've got a big complex situation to work through, because we have traders in the mix, we have intermediary tanneries in the mix that are all going to have to play a part, and it will affect chemical companies, because that's also input material into manufacture of that end product. Machinery companies, everybody will be drawn into this mix. So we don't know yet exactly what due diligence entails. And we also don't know the cut-off size for the size of organisation. We know they're talking about it being large organisations, not small and medium enterprises. Although there are many NGOs who are already saying that it should be extended to those small and medium enterprises, and that nobody should be excluded from these regulations. So even though in the first instance it might just be the larger organisations, who knows? In a few years' time, that could be extended out to the small and medium enterprises. These are the things that we don't know. So what can we do right now? Well, start working with your value chain. And when I say that, I'm not encouraging anybody to say, you need to do this or I can't work with you anymore. That's not the solution either. But start to at least understand where you're at with your value chain, how far you can get back, either directly or indirectly through your next tier back. And get the lay of the land. You know, we can't do anything unless we know where we're starting from. So that's really important. And once you establish that, then you can figure out where your hotspots are. What are your risks? I mean, if you're already not sourcing from Brazil, then okay, it's quite low risk right now when we're thinking about forest risk. But there could be other hotspots or concerns that you should be thinking about. So deforestation is a big concern environmentally, and that's what most of this legislation is designed about. But there are other pieces of legislation out there. There are things to do with waste directives. We know France have a waste directive in place now. There are other ones about marketing claims and legal cases now being brought against brands that are in breach of what they're talking about in terms of marketing claims. So we're talking about deforestation as being a primary impactor for leather, but there are lots of other things that will continue to come. And now this legislation is starting, I think it will only continue in the coming years. So don't stop sourcing, but start working more proactively with your value chains to find those solutions now. And if you have got a risk, how can you address it? Whether it's a social risk, whether it's an environmental risk, whether it's a sourcing risk. Look at it, start taking action. And Kerry said earlier, support your associations. And that doesn't just extend to those communication associations, it also extends to those non-profits that are providing the assurance of the information that's being put out there and the verification of what is being done, so that when you are putting out a claim, you can back it up and substantiate it. And I think with that, I will say thank you very much. I've probably talked for too long, but if you want more information, on the slides there are the links to those 3 pieces of legislation, so you can look at those in more detail. You can always reach out to me for more information. Thank you.
A couple of minutes. Well, actually, we haven't got too much time for the questions, but I think there's a lot of interesting information that I will give you your certificate. But in particular, I'm just wondering whether some of the organisations that have been established on the forestation side, like places like the FSC and PEFC, whether they will have a role to play working alongside people who are more expert in materials to deliver some of the solutions.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've realised in the last few months, more particularly in the last few months, is that there are a host of organisations already out there that do parts of the job, and that certainly are good resource hubs and people who have real expertise on the ground. You know, and I think that's something that's really important. It's very difficult for us to do it sitting in our little office over here if we're not there working with the people on the ground where the problem is. And when we think about ranching in Brazil, 250 million small ranchers herding 178 million head of cattle, it's a huge task. We can't just turn a tap on overnight. But there are satellites, there are ways in which we can hook into existing technologies to support the process. And yes, there are some great NGOs out there that are looking after forestry, that are looking after social and human rights in specific areas that we should be working more closely together with. And it's something that I think we struggle with. We quite often work in silos instead of pooling together that information. The meat packers, you know, and one of the things, sorry, I'm talking again, but one of the things that was apparent when I was in Brazil was that I visited a meat packer that had a great system for traceability, and they'd already assessed and evaluated their supply base and ranked them into high risk, low risk and medium risk. So they knew the work that they needed to do, and they had this great IT system and they spend millions on it every year. I then went to a tannery that also has a great IT system looking at exactly the same stuff, that buys material from the meat packer. But their two systems were not talking to each other, they weren't connecting. And that's what we need to do more of. We need to connect those systems, but at the same time protect the integrity of each individual organisation within that. So challenging, but it is doable. Michael's got a question.
Just one comment about this. We have as well experience with this. Do you think it's a technological or commercial problem?
Oh, there's a good question.
How confident is that?
Oh, it is. You know, the work that we did with the UN, one of the key drivers for me was to make sure that it maintained its interoperability. Because there is no point in coming up with some highly technological solution that again only works on one tier of the industry. We have to have something that can work across all levels and all regions. So one of the things that we did within the UN project when we were looking at a system was come up and develop the architecture that provides a good, robust traceability chain of custody. So it's what data should be exchanged, at which points, by which parties and how, rather than being prescriptive about what technology you should use or what system you should use. We've done a leather blockchain pilot as part of the same work. Crucially, that's not a commercial offering. It's still a pilot project. It's proving very useful to prove the efficacy of the approach, but it is going to need some kind of commerce to drive that solution forward. And then, of course, when you get into the commercial realm of it, then you get that protection of data, how we look after that. If somebody owns that data and they're a private company, then what assurances have we got around that? But if you make it governmental, then how does that work across different geographic regions? There's a whole hot pot of things to kind of think about. And I think that we just felt that we've got to start somewhere. And if we get the architecture that can underpin any system anywhere, and then think about getting those systems to talk to each other interoperably, that's when you get your APIs and things coming into play. You've still got protections to build in, but it is doable.
The extra problem, of course, now too, is that with supply chains getting much more difficult due to all the stuff that's going on in the world, people change their minds. The managing directors were driving the other day, the managing director of I'm not sure who it was Iceland or who it was, and said that they're going back to supplying palm oil because they can't get enough linseed oil or olive oil, so they have no alternative. They want to supply. And then there was another chain too coming in who are actually restricting the amount of oil that they actually sell to each person. It's about 3 bottles. So supply chains are being very badly affected, in fact, without all the legislation.
Yeah, exactly. And those supply demand issues, you know, are going to have an impact and effect. Well, we're already feeling the impact, aren't we, in some areas of the leather industry just from what's happening. And that can also knock back the improvements in sustainability that we need, because people have to go back to their old sources, as you've just said, because they haven't got an alternative. So it's
business otherwise, potentially anyway.
Yeah, we live in interesting times, isn't that what they say?
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. And let's also take it through what you just said. Thank you.
Yeah, it was so quick.
Sorry.
This is not hot.
Seen enough of me.